It is a great pleasure for me to talk to all of you, and I'm very excited that I can be here in Poznan. This is actually quite a bit of a tradition. I think it's at least my third, maybe even the fourth visit. So in a way, I'm trying to practice what I'm preaching. I mean, when you talk about globalism, then you should try to be a little bit global. And so for me, the connection between Tucson and Poznan is a very valuable one. And I really appreciate also the interdisciplinary approach. That is one of my key interests. I come from the discipline of medieval German studies. I've expanded vastly to European medieval literature and then vastly to European, at least Western, and now more or less other cultures so cultural history. And so I try always every year to bring together scholars from all over the world. And one of the greatest advantages, really, I have to say, of COVID-19 for me has been that I've been able to attract scholars really virtually from all over the world. And we have had a conference like this one. This was a conference in end of April. And then people from Mali, Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Czech Republic, Japan, and so forth. This suddenly becomes possible. However, on a personal note, I much more prefer to be here in person. And it's a very different situation, and I think we all can engage with each other in a much different way. I just finished the big Kalamazoo conference. It was all online. It's okay, yes. It has certain advantages, but we're really missing out something. I think we all learn a lot from each other, even if we have different opinions, but just our conversation, I learned quite a bit right there, different perspectives, and I had questions for him. I think that's what scholarship really is all about. So I really appreciate the fact that it's Friday afternoon, it's hot, it's end of the week, and so many people are here, so I really feel very honored to see so many of you. And my greatest concern is always that I don't simply present my findings or my concepts, but rather that we can engage in a conversation as much as possible. So can you give me a timeline roughly, so that because I want to really have a question and answer. Yeah, very good. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, great. So once again, this is a great opportunity for me, and this is, for me, actually a unique situation because I'm right now in the midst of writing or finishing already the introduction to the new book. So based on the conference we had, very, very interdisciplinary, from people in the history of medicine to people in medieval Arabic literature, to Western literature, to historians, and so forth. So this book will right now be an address to the most latest, most pressing, and most difficult challenges. When I talk about globalism before globalism, then I really address ultimately a concern that affects colleagues all over the world. So, for example, in Brazil, there is a journal, Esboços, which deals exactly with this question of global history. So there is, in a way, there is an uprising in many parts of this world against the westernization, the Eurocentrism, and the desire to bring things together. Whether this is all possible is a big question. And what I will be able to present to you is, to some extent, the controversies that affect all our field. Many, many different perspectives have been raised. There are lots of different schools of thought. There's a lot of different materials brought to the table. And I try to forge my own path toward the goal of addressing and making this possible. You can see already from the title that I belong to the one school that believes that globalism actually was in place long before modern globalism. It would behoove me maybe to define globalism, but that's sort of a very generic thing. Normally people talk about globalism in the context of the 20th or 21st century, with the connections, economic connections everywhere. But the claim here and I'm trying to promote this further, is of course we have many different examples of global connections, and the key word might be networking. So to what extent was it possible for people in the past to network? And I would like to introduce lots of different materials, and we can see how that fits into our general discussion. Some of that will be historical, some of that will be art historical, some of that will be purely historical, travels, mappe mundi, and so forth. And I've chosen as a background for my presentation a wonderful scene from somewhere, probably the Rocky Mountains, simply to give us sort of a little bit a sense of the global. My own world looks very, very different. Where I live, that is really a semi-arid desert. But I'm very happy that I can bring from the semi-arid desert maybe some new thoughts to your wonderful world here in Western Poland. I'm very happy to be here. So, all right, let's start with this. A few theoretical reflections. That is most difficult and most hotly disputed area. Lots of scholars are debating even the possibilities and whether we can even talk about globalism as such. I have here two major names that I need to bring to the discussion, namely whether globalism already existed in the modern world. One of the strongest ones is Geraldine Hing, who teaches at the University of Austin, Texas, has written several major books and argues in strong terms that globalism already existed. And of course, we could maybe or should differentiate between these two words, globalization versus globalism. And I think globalism means more the general situation of existing networks, whereas globalization carries over more sort of the meaning of colonialism or empire building. So these are two different things. Immanuel Wallerstein is a more theoretical thinker about globalism, but he does not work too much with medieval concepts. You find tons of studies on globalism in modern economic and historical context. That does not concern me so much. So the general question we all have to raise then is, what kind of connections might even have been possible? To what extent were people able to travel? What interest did they have? What did they know? What linguistic abilities existed? And then who would really have been involved in this global context? I will be able to deviate from my PowerPoint all the time, and I will just do this here. One very quick example is the marriage of a Byzantine princess in the 10th century with, I think it was Otto II, so up there in Magdeburg. So suddenly you have a little island of Greek culture up there in northern Germany. That is wild. How was that possible? And at the same time, Arab embassy came from Cordoba to visit the emperor in Magdeburg. And they reported, for example, about a martyr who had died in Cordoba in the 10th century, namely Pelagius, and then a Latin-writing poet there in Bad Gandersheim, namely Roswitha of Gandersheim, wrote a religious play on that martyr in Cordoba. So you have a triangular relationship between Andalusia, Byzantium, and northern Germany. If that is not an early form of globalism, then I don't know what it is. Okay? Of course, we are facing a theoretical problem. We all probably come from a more Western perspective. I'm also limited. I don't know enough about China, Japan, India, the Philippines. I will be able to go into some of those aspects, but I always have a little bit the bias of Western perspective. I'm limited in this. But already you can see how easily we can expand on that and rebel against anyone who might argue against this. I'm looking at all kinds of different subject matters, and we need the help of lots of different scholars in different disciplines in order to promote this subject matter. If you just talk about commerce, trade, you have always traders, merchants traveling all over the world, and already in the 10th and 11th centuries you hear of a lot of European travelers, a lot of Jewish merchants, for example, but also the other way around. So that will be a topic I have to look much more into it. In context would be the Silk Road, lots of Chinese products coming to the Black Sea area, from the Black Sea then to the Adriatic Sea, and from there then to Northern Europe. So there are very many different branches that we can look at. Art, that is one of the latest topic, art history, where we're still struggling quite a lot. One of my contributors was looking at the influence of Arabic architecture in Christian architecture, particularly in Italy, but she was not yet fully informed yet. So she's in Italy right now and working on this. Another scholar at my conference looked at medicine, a very critical and very interesting topic, to what extent medical or products or drugs or even perfumes made their way from, let's say, the Arabic or then further Persian and maybe Indian world. Then we could look or need to look into science, philosophy, and literature. Literature is one of actually the best indicators to observe the transmission of culture. So globalism has a lot to do with transfer, translation, transmission. And just to give you, I probably will come back later, I forget, one of the most interesting and most prolific example for globalism is a text called Balaam and Josephat. This is a text that basically tells the story of Gautama Buddha, originally written in the 1st or 2nd century in India, which made then its way in endless variations, first in Persian, then Aramaic, then Greek, then Hebrew, then Arabic, then Latin, then French, German, English, you name it. And so the story of Gautama Buddha was known throughout all of medieval Europe, and there are also artworks in various parts of Austria or Romania depicting this text. So just the incredible march from maybe 2nd century India to the rest of Europe throughout the entire Middle Ages, just on the basis of this one text. To what extent the readers or listeners, the audiences, might have been aware of the original source, that's a totally different question. But we can trace today an incredible network of translations that went from east to west. To what extent west to east, that's another issue. So, all right. We are, of course, also very much limited in this regard when we talk about the participants, the so-called brokers, who were involved in developing networks. We're always talking about a sliver, of course, you know, the small groups of intellectuals, people of particular education, and not certainly the masses. But that's a very common thing. That's what we all have left. We have the sources, so individuals who contributed to the connections. One interesting thing is that was developed by a colleague, Ronald Chia. He has a wonderful article on maps in my volume, Paradigm Shifts, and he looks at late medieval, early modern Chinese maps, and discovered that in the 14th, rather 15th century, China, when we look at the maps, for example, moved basically to a form of Asia-centrism, because they were increasingly challenged by the Mongols. And just studying the history of Chinese maps, we can observe that increasingly even the Arab lands disappeared, not to even speak about Europe. Europe was irrelevant for the Chinese. It was not really a sophisticated country. Even the Mongols thought it was just an appendix. They didn't need very much. So by the late 15th century, Europe basically disappears from the ancient Chinese world map, basically, or mental map. But before, certainly, there are many, many more indications of at least curiosity and interest. I just need to refer to that because it suddenly shows you the complexity of the matter. I'm not into Chinese maps. I don't know enough about it, but these indications that help me to build a larger map of globalism and information that comes from many different directions. A little bit about latest research. I list a couple of studies. Without going into the details, I just want to confirm how much this topic is really exciting researchers all over the world. Many of those published in English, but you can see here, for example, this interesting new term, Euraphasia chronologies. That reflects very much the latest concern to what extent, for example, medieval Africa was in connection with medieval Europe. And we have a number of new studies that talk about the trade between the kingdom of Mali, for example, across the Sahara to the northern or the southern shore of the Mediterranean. And we have a number of very recent studies that really try to bring African history into the fold of European history. And there are indeed many more connections that we need to explore in the future. This is also by Bearcroft, in the ecology of world literature from antiquity to the present day. That is something that I find almost ironic. There are a lot of attempts by both historians who talk about global world history and literary scholars who create, in my opinion, nothing but a patchwork. Patchwork meaning they just put together pieces here and there, and they don't form a really cohesive whole. So suddenly, let's say, they have a chapter on Chinese history, then a chapter on Persian history, then a chapter on maybe Greek history, and then they jump to maybe the Congo, and then to Peru, and it's all fine and means nothing. In my opinion, that is a very dangerous, very slippery road, because it's a patchwork. I have nothing to do as a Western historian with maybe Mongolian history. So there need to be connections. And I think, particularly in the field of world literature, that's even worse. And they throw in a lot of different texts, and no one knows these texts. The context is then missing, and I think it really does a major disservice to research and to our students. This is the practice of global history, European perspectives. I don't go into the details. Another major volume edited by Matthias Medell in 2019. Then here by our famous colleague in Berlin, Michael Borgolte, Europa im Geflecht der Welt, mittelalterliche Migrationen in globalen Bezügen. That is an interesting aspect, because he integrates the term migration. And I think in terms of migration, that means movement of people, you find probably much more evidence supporting a whole notion of globalism before modern, maybe before modern migrations. You have much more flux of population than we might think. In one of my recent monographs, I worked on a book on freedom, imprisonment and slavery, and then I had a follow-up volume also dealing with incarceration. But the topic of slavery, for example, is extremely interesting insofar as we have slaves from all over the world, really, let's say, practically merging in the Mediterranean, but also farther west. Archaeologists, other very important contributors to our field, have, for example, found very recently, maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago, that a major cemetery in London from about 1348, 1350, following the Black Death, consisted of, according to DNA samples, of about 26% of the entire population buried there in the cemetery of non-European origins. What the heck does that mean? 26% of the people buried there in London were maybe black. And we don't know anything about them. Only now we find sort of their traces. That is amazing. Yeah, no one wanted to talk about their slaves, but The DNA is there. So that is really very interesting, and I have many more points to mention. Other globes, past and peripheral imaginations of globalization. I need to mention something in that context. Geraldine Hang and others arguing vehemently and strongly against the clash between, these are the two words, core and periphery. So they argue that it is not fair and not right to divvy up world history into cores or central places of culture or whatever it might be, or science, and then the periphery. And they insist that we really need to equalize the world. That's a very strong argument, but at the same time, I have problems with that, because if you equalize everything, and then you might say the history of the Amazon Indians in the 11th century is just as important as the situation of 12th century Paris Sorbonne University. Sorry, these are totally two different things. And I personally don't care about hegemonization. Why not? Those in the hegemony are simply those who produce texts, who create artwork, establish networks. And those people are interesting, for me at least. So if we have to leave some people in the dust, let's say ordinary rural population, fine. Nothing against them. They're all equal as human beings. But when I look at networking, then I need to look at people who were the makers and shakers. And I cannot be content simply with saying all people are equal and they all belong to the same global family. Yeah, so what? That leaves me with nothing. So I want to differentiate and qualify a little bit further. This is another study. So in a way, it's almost endless, to the point that we have so many different publications, and they're all struggling very much to come to terms with this here, a companion to the global early Middle Ages. Very interesting subject matter. Here, the edited volume, Islamic and European Expansion, the Forging of a Global Order. So trying, this is a little bit older, 1993, but trying to inject more the Islamic perspective. And that is, of course, here a huge problem I face myself, and probably everyone here in the room, or maybe not all, but I don't know, and I cannot read Arabic. So there's a huge block for me, and I don't read Chinese and so forth. There's so many different languages. I don't read Persian, and so forth and so forth. And I feel very strongly that I ought to know, but I cannot. So that, in other words, we need collaboration. So the more we can ask then colleagues who speak those languages and can read those texts, the better for our general notion. But of course, the relationship between the Islamic world and the European world was of extreme importance. But as soon as you move into the Islamic world, you suddenly notice that their focus was really very different. They didn't care that much about Europe. They cared about the Saudi Arabic Peninsula, Persia, and then further east, Malaysia and Philippines. So the focus is sometimes very, very different, but you can learn quite a lot. This was a very interesting volume by Klaus Oschema from Bochum and others. Abrahams Erbe, Konkurrenz, Konflikt und Koexistenz der Religionen im europäischen Mittelalter. Still a very Western perspective, but the clash of the religions and the exchange amongst the various representatives in that volume that you listed there. This is one of the most interesting topics. I cannot go too much into that, it would sidetrack me a lot, but the whole question, to what extent during the Middle Ages did people engage with representatives of other religions? And maybe one of the interesting topics would be, and I can go into details if you wish, the translation of the Quran. It's a very, very interesting topic, and I can tell you quite a lot. I know quite a lot about the translations and the conflicts with all of that. But an indication how much globalism requires a lot of language knowledge. And there's always a question, who has that? Anyway, then, I mean, I will go on a little bit more because I have just too many topics and too many efforts. But I see always sort of the same trend. It is very fashionable to use the catchword global, and then you just write whatever just comes to your mind. Very global, it means at the end, nothing. So it's always the challenge. And I, as a philologist and an historian, cultural historian, if I may call myself like that, is always go back to the sources and don't tell me these big, or give me these big pictures. I need evidence. I need really solid source studies. And so that's the problem a little bit with all these different studies that I list here. This is more a modern study for modern globalization. I don't need this. But this is one of the major studies. Very thin book, maybe 100 pages or so, but she summarizes very nicely the controversy and presents a lot of the major arguments. So I'm a little bit negative as well, because I'm afraid that because of the war in the Ukraine, we might suddenly face the end of globalism, even in the modern world. Who knows what is happening, because the Western industries, as you know, is withdrawing from Russia left and right. Even China, as the Chinese market, is in danger. So is maybe the West retreating from globalism? I don't know. The future will tell. So it might be ironic, the end of globalism just in the global age. So it behooves us to look more maybe what happened before. And so then the problem might, of course, be, but I think I can ease those problems, is the danger, are we not maybe anachronistic? Could it be that we are talking about globalism simply because we are living in a global world and try to find sort of analogies or similar points in the past? So that's simply a question I have always to keep in mind. But I think we have also a lot of different meanings of globalism. In other words, what do I mean by that? Am I talking about economic connections? Am I talking about military conflicts or collaboration? And I mentioned already a couple of examples of literary, artistic, or political connections. The entire world of diplomacy, for example, is very, very interesting. Where did the diplomats go? We know that, a simple example, Harun al-Rashid sends what was his name? Abbas, the elephant, in 806 to Aachen. How many thousand miles are this? I don't know. This poor animal had to walk for 6 years all the way along the North African coast, and then by ship across to Marseille or somewhere, and then all the way north. Lived only 6 years after that, but the diplomatic connection, that is interesting, that Harun al-Rashid had heard about Charlemagne and wanted to make sure that kings or sultan exchange things. That is an interesting point that we need always to keep in mind. Maybe the diplomats, they existed already at that time, just did not leave enough sources, or we have not paid enough attention to their accounts. And let's use just one example, musicians. We know that throughout the entire Middle Ages, musicians were always on the go. And we know that musicians constantly looked for new types of melodies. Sometimes exotic melodies, sometimes exotic instruments. A very famous example would be Tristan in the Tristan and Isolde story, who as a young man reaches then the court of King Mark in Cornwall, where he demonstrates to be the master musician, but he dismisses all these music instruments and says, that's nothing, I can do this with my left hand. But my real instrument is, and he mentions one, which no one ever has heard of. And then he proves to be the absolute master musicians. So musicians got around. We don't know often enough about them, but one of the big questions, which I just like to throw out without having really much of evidence, is the question to what extent the entire discourse on love emerged in medieval Europe in the early 12th century. And the huge debate whether maybe Arabic music might have influence. I have my doubts about it, but in particular because the music is very different, the melodies are very different, but that's something we have certainly to keep in mind. So I just skip this a little bit. And ultimately, I like to frame this all into the history of history of mentality. We have done this so far mostly in a European context, but let's say Jacques Le Goff is a great name, Peter Dinzelbacher, a very, very famous name. I think that is one of the most exciting approaches to history, understanding the mentality, histoire de mentalité. That's the school, Les Annales. And so I think that the globalism would add really an interesting angle or aspect to the history of mentality, maybe because of difference or maybe because of similarities. We'll see. Joseph Nye has already tried to extricate these two terms, globalism versus globalization, and he defines it as such. Globalism at its core seeks to describe and explain nothing more than a world which is characterized by networks of connections that span multi-continental distances. Great, nice definition. Whether this was already in place in the Middle Ages, that's an interesting question. And kind of, as we say in German, wie die Katze den heißen Brei. So I'm going around with really addressing it, and ultimately I will try to get closer. So he also says globalization refers to the increase or decline in the degree of globalism. It focuses on the forces, the dynamisms or speed of these changes. This is more or less driven by modern concepts. So the latest studies, it keeps going. It's just incredible. Catherine Holmes, Global Middle Ages, the East. So looking more at Chinese history or so that just appeared very recently. And I have the problem, that's the search for single global narrative, as if they all could talk the same language. That was certainly not the case. I think, if at all, and I think it is valuable, we have to distinguish further meetings of different narratives that intersected. Okay, let me repeat that. That's very important. So I do not think that we have a global narrative. I don't believe that's even faintly correct. But what we do probably can find, that's what I'm interested in, is the interconnection of various narratives that meet and exchange, lock into each other and separate once again. And that is constantly in flux. I think that's a more concrete approach to that. We can always determine economic contexts. That is maybe so self-evident that I don't need to go much further into the details, but money has always ruled the entire world history, and the interest in exotic products coming from the East has always been of a major factor. And archaeologists have proven already many times through funeral gifts how much, let's say, Asian products made their way into Swedish graves and so forth. So that interest can be traced everywhere. One of the latest interesting subject matters which confirms this further, again, it's not at all my field, but you can see how much the interdisciplinary approach allows me to do this. It's the object of the Gerfalcon. The Gerfalcon, G-Y-R, falcon, is a very fast bird of prey. And in Mamluk Egypt and other parts, they enjoyed the Gerfalcon very much during the 12th, 13th centuries, and normally imported that bird from the northeastern Asia, maybe Mongolia. Latest research in falconry, however, has discovered that by the 13th century, the import of Gerfalcons from Iceland to Egypt can be confirmed. It is absolutely unbelievable that these traders brought the very valuable Gerfalcons to Egypt. That is amazing. That's connection. That is where the economic interest suddenly can bridge and span huge differences. That's not a narrative, but they could talk. They could barter the price, whatever it might be. It sounds silly, a gerfalcon. I mean, but raised up there, Scandinavia, northern Scandinavia, and making its way suddenly to Egypt or neighboring countries. So, and another very important term, and I've mentioned it already once before, and I bring it back here to the table, the term, at least that's used in American English jargon, the broker. So normally it comes from the stock markets, but the brokers are those who negotiate and build bridges, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I need to expand immediately the Black Sea. The Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean were zones of contacts with many different cultures coming together. Greek, Jewish, Mongols, if you will, Genoa, Venice, African cultures, Ethiopia, Persia. So the brokers in those areas were those who spoke lots of different languages, had the resources to trade, to communicate, to exchange, and so building networks. So I think the term broker is a really useful one because these are not the masses, but individuals who can work in particular to establish the networks. And that's probably the same case as today. I regard myself a little bit as a broker because I'm here and you allow me to do a little bit global work. You know, that's very nice, I think. So, or networking, that's also very of a key term to what extent people can exchange information and build connections. That means letters. So this is a major subject matter in historical research, right? Letters. Who wrote letters? What letter collections do we have? From where did those letters come in? And so forth. Another very nice topic would be related to that, marriage. How many princesses married from one country to a completely different one? I don't know enough about the Asian or Arabic world, but I have very good examples. Let's say Anne of Bohemia marrying, I forget the name, the king, whatever, British King Richard II, maybe? I'm not quite sure. But she moved her entire household, including her Bibles and her texts, liturgical texts, and the whole household from Prague to London. That's brokerage. And lots of women went through this experience. Particularly in the 15th century, I know a number of other princesses from northern Scotland, for example, the later Anne of Austria, or the French princess Elizabeth marrying the Count of Nassau, and then suddenly cultural contacts take place. To what extent this also can be extended further east, I don't know, but it's very, very likely, let's say, the Arabic princesses married here and there. A beautiful literary example is Boccaccio. Boccaccio in his Decameron. It's day 2, story 7, where the Sultan's daughter, Alatiel, is supposed to marry the king of the Algarve. That's somewhere in Morocco. It's just a literary projection, and the ship makes its way almost all across the Mediterranean, then shipwreck, and only the Alatiel survives, and she speaks only Arabic. Then she is rescued, and then, well, rescued by a nobleman, a knight, who then sleeps with her, and because she's so attractive, then this knight is murdered, she's abducted, and then she goes from one man to another man. Ultimately, she sleeps with 8 men and leaves behind lots of dead bodies, because everyone is jealous and everyone wants to sleep with her. So she makes the whole way Eastern Mediterranean, Western Mediterranean, back to the Eastern Mediterranean, and then can come home again and pretend still to be a virgin. Miracle. And and then finally her future husband, the Arabic king of the Algarve, sends troops and they bring her back safely to the Western world. So just as a literary projection, I know this is not historical fact, that's fiction, but fiction serves us really well as a platform for imaginations. What did they conceive as possible? So that's what I mean, fantasy and reality. These two components have to come together. But we have here this beautiful example, Marco Polo. We know exactly that he traveled, and the lack of success he had with his travels was really because it was boring. He talked about reality. So, for example, he refers to the salamander, and medieval imagination was that salamanders live in fire. And he says, no, I'm now using the modern word, no, this is asbestos. Asbestos doesn't burn. He refers to the unicorn, and he says, no, that's a rhinoceros. So that's the reason why his travels were kind of boring, because he talked so much about the reality, the facts. John Mandeville, Mandeville, he goes into all these fantasies and all the monsters, that's great, and that's exactly what people liked. Very successful. Mandeville was the bestseller of his time. And he presents the entire world to the east, Philippines, Japan, and so forth, but always monsters. So an interesting contrast, a concrete traveler and then the armchair traveler. Others were very, very interesting, and I should have switched this around. Already in the 4th century, we have, I think, a French woman, Egeria, who travels by herself to the Holy Land. And if that was possible for a woman in the 4th century, then you can imagine how many other women probably traveled as well. One of the most daring ones, she doesn't quite fit into the notion of globalism, but Marjorie Kemp, that's early 15th century, she travels by herself without any money or any language knowledge, first to Rome, to Jerusalem, then to Santiago de Compostela, then later to Norway, and ends up here in Poland, in Gdańsk, and then slowly made her way back to England. So if a woman can do that, what did other people do? Such as Felix Fabry, a major Dominican, who writes a beautiful, wonderful, extensive travel log, Evagatorium, in which he gives us so many really concrete details. And he deserves really full attention, because he's the only one I've ever found who describes in very graphic terms what is happening on the ship and when they have to use the bathroom and the big storm comes in. And he is talking about the shitty situation. It's amazing. He goes really into the details and the cramped quarters and so forth. And if he is so interested in the real concrete situation, the daily lives, and then how he then meets people who help him to rent asses or donkeys, and how he then on his second trip, 1483 or so, then brings a gift with him for his previous guide, because he remembered him. And then from there he goes all over the Holy Land. So there are many different possibilities. Just two extreme points, Egeria and Felix Fabry. And also, by the way, Felix Fabry was, I'm not sure whether you're aware about it, he also wrote Sion's Pilgrims, meaning he wrote the same pilgrimage account for women, for cloistered women who, however, could not travel. So he says, so much better. That's zoom. You zoom in to whatever, the holy site, and here you pray. You don't have to ask for the key. You don't have to pay for the entrance fee. You just read it, and you're doing just fine. So it's kind of fun to see both reality and fantasy. Well, not fantasy, but the possibility to imagine the entire trip to the Eastern world. You're working on maps. I refer to Mappemundi. We have a huge amount of maps. Of course, none of them were really concrete, or none of them were really served as a basis for travel. It would be absurd. I mean, we talked about the Ebsdorf map, which was as big maybe, or is as big as the entire wall. You wouldn't take such a huge map to travel. No, this was for maybe instruction, for religious instructions or whatever. I refer to Karen Pinto, who is one of the greatest experts on Arabic maps. So again, this is the collaboration I'm looking for, where then scholars in different disciplines or with different materials can contribute to create more connecting points so that we can slowly build this map that I'm trying to refer to. I discussed this already, so global trade. I can skip this now. And this is the reference. So in case you want to read more about it, it just appeared last year. So as you said, cutting edge, I try to be there. So because I review so many books, I know always what's going on. It has a certain advantage, but it's a really fantastic study. So let's look at some of the very well-known global players. I would like to introduce them in very concrete terms. I would like to argue that if at all we can talk about globalism, networking, connectivity, then we just need to look at people who managed to do that. So I start with the Huns, of course. You have in the early Middle Ages massive migrations or military operations. If you will, think about the Germanic migration, which was a massive movement of people, maybe always the vanguards, but whether you think about the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, you name them all. But the Huns really as some of the major movers and shakers who made their way all the way to the West. And I would call them really in their mobility, which is another key term for our discussion, their mobility as significant contributors. If at all, then let's look at the Huns. I like to think about the Arabs as global players. Look at this wonderful map, how far they got. But, Europe was just on the sideline for them. Yes, they made their way to Andalus, a little bit to the Provence, but then they were defeated. And so their focus was really much more what we call today Iran, Iraq, and then up there Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, maybe into Pakistan and Afghanistan. So that's, in a way, certainly a global player. And if you look at the waterways, you suddenly understand also why they mattered so much, because the Arabs entertained a lot of connections, of course, with China. So through trade, that's a lot of things that I don't know enough, but it's certainly the fact that the Chinese, early Chinese had, as I mentioned at the beginning, they had the Arabic world still very much in their viewpoint, and only later lost that because of the Mongol threat, so they were refocusing away. So you could say the Arabs as intermediary players. And then I really like to talk about the Vikings, who are in many different ways global players. Let's take a look at the maps. I have here Finland or Newfoundland. Just the very latest archaeological research has confirmed that they settled there in 1016. Didn't stay too long, but you can see the enormous outreach: Iceland, Greenland, Finland. And when you then read some of the Icelandic sagas from the 13th, 14th centuries, you regularly hear of very strange global aspects, because many times when a hero has done some murder or has a military political conflict, he is exiled. That was the common practice amongst the Icelanders. And what they commonly did, you can see here the dates, the battles down there, they joined the Byzantine army. The Icelanders formed their own military unit. And it's amazing. Icelanders serving as a battalion for the Byzantine emperor. It's wild, right? That's so unexpected. But when you read this, and then you say, well, I was exiled, so he went to Europe and then went down to Constantinople, and joined the forces, and that was it. And then they don't go into any further elements. What does it tell us? It tells us that the globalism existed, but they didn't really regard it as such an exceptional thing. Maybe we are victims of misconceptions. We think so much globalism is the only phenomenon of the 21st century. When it exists, of course, long, long before us, of course in the Middle Ages, just people didn't talk so much about it. For them it was natural that traders made their way all over the place. And then sometimes they mention this, sometimes they don't, but it was a very common thing. And then, well, I could go very much into medieval literature where you have then plenty of evidence, but I just skip over that a little bit because there are too many details I would have to go into. But so at least you see some of the names where the poets at least project. That's all I can say. I cannot say that they proved there, but I can say that many poets projected the possibility that their protagonists served far somewhere in the East. So Gahboret, for example, and that's the only one I will discuss more at length, is the second son. His father dies. So what does he do? Well, he doesn't inherit anything, so he just leaves. And with some money, of course, and weapons. And then he joins the military service of the Sultan of Babylon. And that's fine, and everyone loves him. When he later dies, the Sultan has a fabulous tomb for him in Arabic and Christian, in Latin. And so they just accept that. A European knight fighting for the Sultan, and that's just fine. And they regard him a lot. We have this a lot of times. We have very many pan-European texts where the protagonists travel all over the place. And I mean, with pan-European, these were extremely popular texts. So I just skipped this a little bit. You can see the popularity of Alexander the Great is a huge myth. You have massive amounts of texts in India and in maybe Western China and so forth, dealing with the same myth as the people in the West. So you have both the Western myth as well as the Eastern myth, just as an indication. Then very much for the Eastern Mediterranean, the very famous story of Apollonius of Tyre from the 2nd century in Greek to the 16th, 17th centuries in many different languages. And King Tars is the opposite move from, it's an English text, from the East to England. And here, this text I've worked on a lot myself, which is so interesting. Rudolf von Ems, early 13th century, and he is also one of those who writes this Buddha story I mentioned at the beginning, but I'll leave that aside now. But he also wrote this story, The Good Gerhard, which is a story very unusual, the only one I know of in the entire Middle Ages of a merchant. A merchant of Cologne is the protagonist. And he goes on extensive business travel, Nineveh, Damascus, and that's fine. There's no further discussion. There is no need to discuss the global connections. So he just comes back later and crosses the Mediterranean, arrives in Morocco, and there he strikes friendship with the local Castellan. They have a business deal with some prisoners. There's some Norwegians and English people, and everything works out just fine. That's all I need to say at this point, otherwise I lose myself. Just simply the literary projection of global connections are always there. And when they don't talk much about it, then probably because it was so much accepted as a standard feature. Two more examples quickly. Melusine, a very, very popular story. You all know it from Starbucks, maybe. If you drink coffee, you see on their cups the Melusine figure. And this is then a story from, well, there's in French and in German and lots of artworks dealing with her. But the Melusine's sons travel all over the Eastern world and establish their own kingdoms. That's the one possibility. And then the latest one is Fortunatus, an extremely popular text, first printed in 1509, and the son, Fortunatus, starts out in Cyprus, makes his way to Flanders, from there to England, from there then he returns, then gets a magical purse. You can see this here in this woodcut, which never becomes empty, which would be very nice, sort of medieval credit card, unlimited credit card. Anyway, from there then he traverses all of Europe, north-south, south-north, up to Egypt and Constantinople, marries, settles in Cyprus, and then later goes on a huge tour through Egypt, and then all the way to India, where he meets the Prester John, and then returns home. Just literary imagination. We don't need to go much further, but of course this was popular because it appealed to the merchant mentality. So printed in Augsburg, of course, one of the major centers. Augsburg, connection between, you could say, London, Augsburg, Venice, Constantinople, Beijing. That was sort of the trade route. And of course, those merchants enjoyed texts that projected international travel. You could ask me, is that really globalism? Well, yes, I would say it's a form of globalism because it projects at least the possibilities of networks. And that's what I only can really confirm at this point. We could go also into a lot of pilgrimage accounts. I skip this a little bit and emphasize here der Niederrheinische Orientbericht. That is a text I would like to translate soon. It is one of the most interesting ones. It's sort of the German Marco Polo, except the author, somewhere Cologne probably, didn't travel. He only lived there, somewhere. I don't know where. Damascus maybe Beirut, I don't know. He doesn't say, but he describes so many facts of marriages going on and local practices and customs and historical events. He talks about Armenia, Georgia, then Mongolia. He goes up in his report up to Kazakhstan, India. Of course, there's a lot of learned material, of course, a lot of drawing from other sources, but he obviously lived there for about 12 years and so left this amazing report. It contains also a lot of references to local fauna and flora, so it's even interesting from that point of view. And just here, we have fortunately just very recent, 2019, the modern German translation by Helmut Brall, and then the critical edition just appeared about 6 months ago. So we have a really valuable source here that deserves much more attention for the near future. It's in Low German, so anyway, just as an illustration, you see the manuscript. It is one of those tragic cases. We almost would have lost it. About 15 years ago, the Cologne Historical Archive collapsed. Just simply collapsed. And about 40 to 50% of all manuscripts were destroyed, lost to fire and water. And this text was saved. But you can see Middle Ages are still always at risk. If we had lost it, we could not talk about this. This is a very important source, confirming, at least from one point of view, that globalism was a possibility, at least in the minds of individuals. Okay, that's all I can really say. So I just go through this very quickly. I summarized this already. I just want to skip this and slowly come to conclusion. So he pays a lot of respect to the Muslim culture. This is very significant. We find this quite a number of times. Travelers, also another Cologne traveler, Arnold von Harf. I have not included him, who traveled all over the world, particularly Muslim world, and pays a lot of respect, gives us a lot of details about Cairo, for example, very detailed, the provision of water there, and so forth. So there are a lot of contexts, a lot of texts, and surprisingly, little interest in criticizing other religions. So I think that becomes extremely interesting because the degree of curiosity grew considerably at that time. So they report about a strange world, but treated it with more or less equal terms. So, not everyone, of course. There are lots of pilgrimage authors who had a very negative, xenophobic attitude, but lots also who described in very respectful terms. One little example might be, one more time, Marjorie Kemp, who had a lot of trouble because she was a mystic, cried a lot, and the other male pilgrims hated her and wanted to get rid of her. And when she wanted to climb later in the Holy Land, famous mountain, no one helped her except for an Arabic man, and she pays great respect to him. Yeah, he was nice to me, helped me in that situation. So even in the most Christian context, suddenly there could be a reference to tolerant attitude. And tolerance is one of the preconditions for globalism. So, okay, I just skip over this a little bit. You can see how much he's talking about. Also, he refers to the Mongols and that they use paper money, very important aspect. Here's a reference to a study on the influx of Buddhism by Romeo Schmitz-Esser in this volume. So he has more evidence about that. Trade between East and West. I skip this. Here are my conclusions. Now, so we have a lot of data. The map that I tried to project is still very fragmentary. We know a lot more now about medieval awareness or pre-modern awareness about other peoples, their cultures and customs. We have a lot of data concerning military conflicts, which are very interesting because military conflicts always contribute in a certain way, despite all terrible issues, to connections, oftentimes settlements, marriages, and so forth. There are a lot of reports about animals, birds, and plants, so fauna and flora, as found in other parts of the world. And the anonymous author of the Niederrheinische Orientbericht was obviously very strongly aware of the great interest people might have about this information. And it's firsthand. And that is really an eyewitness. And it's much more important, and that's the reason why I compared with Marco Polo. It's very important as a direct eyewitness account. We can trust him to some extent. There's always a certain degree of drawing from sources, and a little bit fabulation here and there, but it's much more serious than almost anything else. There's curiosity and respect, maybe even early toleration, and I call it global perspectives. That is really different. So, okay, I skip all this a little bit. So I could go now into many different aspects, but I think I will extend the time I have too much, right? Well, yeah, okay. Just referring also to Arabic travelers, very interesting, Ibn Fadlan and Ibn Battuta. So there are many others, and I also would like to refer to a Chinese traveler, namely Rabban Sauma, of whom I learned only very recently myself, who was maybe an Uyghur, so northwestern China today. He traveled to Jerusalem, but he stayed then in Baghdad. He was probably an historian, and then made a second trip to Europe in about the 1280s, and some at least of his partners talked to him in Persian. That is the map as we imagined he took. That is really, if at all, then this is a global traveler. And he is just one, probably of many others. I myself only scratching the surface and look for many, many other comments about all this. But this is more or less the Silk Route. And of course, this is funny. The Chinese are trying right now to reconstitute the Silk Route. I mean, it's like the medieval Silk Route is now reinvested in the modern Silk Route. So, okay, just waiting for you. Okay, good. Here are my conclusions. I would like to say that virtually every culture is somehow the result of globalism, meaning that everyone who writes, everyone who is doing business, everyone who is in architecture or music will know of other things, will have traveled. So the whole notion of medieval people being parochial and non-worldly is completely wrong. We know this already since Norbert Ohler's famous study, Travel in the Middle Ages. Medieval roads were filled with people. Of course the farmers stayed home. Of course they couldn't travel. They cannot travel either today. They're bound to their farms. But anyone else was commonly on the road. And I have sort of tried to indicate to what extent then even trade with far away markets was of very common nature. So the situation today is really not that, or I should say the other way around, the Middle Ages were probably not that far away from the situation today. Maybe in terms of quantity, yes, much less than today, but in terms of quality, maybe even much more than we might have thought. And on that note, I just have reached the end of my talk. I would like to express one more time my thanks that I could present this. I find it extremely exciting, and I hope that we can have a little bit of a discussion, because that's really scholarship. That we as scholars become more global and exchange, criticize each other, and help each other promote our understanding. So thank you so much for enduring my long talk, and I appreciate one more time that I could talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a rich and inspiring talk, which opens so many avenues for discussion and debate. So the floor is open for your questions. And I will gently ask everybody to present themselves so that the audience online can know who is speaking.
Okay. So, thank you for a very interesting, excellent lecture. My name is Miłosz Sosnowski. I work here at the department, and I have two questions. I wrote them down because my English got a little rusty lately. But so I was at a Mammoth conference this month with a plenary talk about a South Asian ship from 800s. And this ship was carrying cargo through an Indian Ocean, and mostly this was South Asian stuff, and with some barely discernible signs of Arab influence. And for the speaker, this ship proved much. I kid you not, that was like, haha, 9th century globalization existed. China was already in the industrial age. The Eurocentrism in scholarship is bad and things like that. But is this South Asian ship really global Middle Ages? And this is different than the stuff that you spoke about, Cordoba, Byzantium, Magdeburg, Hans, or the role of Mali, and especially this poor elephant, Abul Abbas, who was shipped to Liguria and died soon after reaching Aachen. But those things are not new at all. And the first question then is, I think, do we need term globalism to study stuff like that? What's the added value? And where and when are the Middle Ages then? Where are they? And the second question, well, connected with this one, is well, the globe is round, it's spherical. And the examples that you gave, obviously they're all over the place. But really not at the same time. Because these are examples of Mediterranean, post-Roman, North Asian. Some are very importantly Christian, or particularly Western Christian. And Rabban Sauma is not Chinese. He is Christian Nestorian. So are the pre-Columbian, to say it Eurocentrically, cultures global? What is global? And why is it global?
Thank you very much. These are interesting and valuable questions. First of all, I would like to also raise the specter that... Oh, forgot. Sorry. About that. Thank you very much for these good questions. They're very constructive and helpful. First, we also are aware of sinocentrism. So when we talk about Eurocentrism, we also have to be very aware that the centrism happens in other parts of the world as well. So the Chinese were very sinocentric. I think that's an important factor. But trade is one of the key components, and I would agree with you that social and economic historians have already for a long time indicated the travel or the economic trade that took place. And let's say archaeologists have found many hoards of coins in Russia, for example, coming from somewhere, Spain and so forth. So that is actually quite well known. But this has not led really to a re-evaluation of the larger connections. Global, I mean, just as you, I'm a little bit worried that we throw in too much into this whole issue. Many people who write these books on global history then immediately throw in Mesoamerica, for example, then the Philippines, and I don't see connections, and I don't know what this would entail. So for me, it is much more important to trace concrete elements, concrete contacts. And let me give you an example of a little bit later time, namely the 17th century. Just when the Chinese turned their attention away from Western world, or Arabic world, to focus more on the north and their own borders, a certain vacuum opened up. And that vacuum was suddenly very quickly filled by the Jesuits. And the Jesuits went to China, Matteo Ricci and others, and they tried, of course, to missionize and extend and build a global network, which they achieved actually, because in the following centuries they were in the Philippines, Mexico, in my area, and in many other parts of the world. So the Jesuits kind of picked up the baton and used it for their own purposes. But what good does it all do if we simply replicate what previous scholars have done and simply put these various parts together? Does it not simply remain a patchwork, as you were kind of asking? And to some extent, I'm just as much as a critic as you are, but at the same time, I think if we pursue further the notion of networking, where does the network actually happen? In other words, I am interested in the nodes. Where are the actual points of contacts? Where did they begin to exchange? When we came down, I just wanted to tell him something about a 17th century, you know, that's not my time, but Adam Olearius, who traveled 1639 or so from Schleswig, first to Moscow, and then on the second trip he goes all the way to Isfahan. It's a massive travelogue, which I have in my own office, printed in 1659, contains several chapters of literature, of Persian literature, in Persian, for a German audience. And that is a transformative element. So I think that helps us to get beyond our narrow confines. In other words, what we learn or profit from it, I think, is that we take things that are all well known. I mean, virtually, you're right. All these things are well known in many different quarters of research and bring them together, so synergy, so that we move beyond a narrow Eurocentric viewpoint. I have nothing against Eurocentric. I mean, that helps me already. Eurocentric is already so hard to do. There are so many different cultures in Europe, I understand. But I would say if we can understand better how the connections happened, if I can trace maybe more specifically trade between London, Augsburg, Venice, Constantinople, and then further east. There's a recent study which I have not included talking about silk trade coming from China, and they used certain patterns. And they went to Black Sea, from there then to to Lucca. And in Lucca, they were so attracted to this that they started copying the Chinese patterns and started their own silk industry, ultimately shutting out the Chinese trade. So that's where you see suddenly influences, and these influences shaping different cultures. If they just stand next to each other and far apart, then what's the point? That's very nice. We give credit, we pay credit or respect to the various cultures. You know, I pay great respect maybe to the Brazilian cultures, that's fine. I would say certainly we medievalists need also to consider Morocco or whatever it might be, or Senegal, but have nothing to do with my subject matter. So I pay respect, due respect to them, but it doesn't do much. I need connections. And that's what I find is then productive, when we can suddenly see how the exchanges took place. Hence, what I referred to quickly to the Huns, Mongols, Saracens. Well, Saracens, I mean Arabs, sorry. Sorry, different story. But let's say the Mongols, they came and left. What did they achieve? Not much. I mean, they didn't leave much of influence. And so they're not really the most helpful players. The Vikings, a different story. They transported a lot of stuff back and forth. So maybe that might help. Would that be okay?
Ich werde lieber Deutsch sprechen, nicht nur zuletzt deswegen, das ist Muttersprache von Profesor Classen, aber es ist auch deswegen, dass für mich bequemer ist. Ja. Zunächst mal eine Sachkorrektur. Ich glaube, also ich denke nicht, dass die Hunnen eine Art Wordplayer waren. Heutzutage die weltgeschichtliche Rolle der Hunnen ist schon längst beschränkt. Ja. Der Hunnensturm hat nicht die gleiche Bedeutung wie zum Beispiel die Ausbreitung von Arabern und so weiter. Ja. Ganz genau sagen, das war eine regionale Macht und nur seit Alleinherrschaft von Attila bis zu seinem Ende 9 Jahren in Mitteleuropa. Ja. Natürlich, es gibt die Forscher, die seit langem linken die Xiongnu mit Hunnen, aber das ist auch unbeweisbar. Also es ist besser, auf dieses Beispiel, ich glaube, zu verzichten. Aber die sind natürlich Urheber seiner Gedanken. Zweitens, die Erscheinung sogenannten Wikinger oder Warerger oder besser, genauer gesagt, Währinger in Osteuropa, ist nicht mehr im 9. Jahrhundert, sondern sicher im 7. Jahrhundert oder vielleicht am Ende des 6. Jahrhunderts. Aber sicher im 7. Jahrhundert. Ja. Im 7. Jahrhundert. Die waren eine besondere Art Wanderer, sozusagen, so Krieger, Kaufmanns, aber vor allem Banditen und Plünderer. Ja. Und die Russland von heute hat sehr viel von Russen, skandinavischen Russen, geerbt. Ja. Nicht nur in dieser Hinsicht. Ja. Aber eine Frage, nämlich die globalistisch denkende Forscher überall finden die gleichen Phänomene. Also im Mittelalter, im Altertum, also ich habe Mehrheit von die Merkmale und Züge, die sie für Mittelalter gefunden haben, ich finde, das passt alles auch für Altertum, ganz sicher. Also die globalistisch denkende Forscher überall finden die gleichen Phänomene. Ja. Aber es gibt krasse Differenzen zwischen diesen Epochen. Und man muss mehr Gewicht auf die Differenzen zu legen, als auf Ähnlichkeiten. Ihre globale Mittelalter ist ohne beiden Ameriken, Australien, fast ohne Afrika. Ja. Ich glaube, die haben sehr gut die kulturelle, politische, religiöse Vernetzung skizziert, aber das ist, ob das wirklich Globalism ist, ist mir nicht ganz klar. ich gehe davon aus, dass man darf nur die wirklich Vergleichbare zu vergleichen. Vielleicht das ist ganz veraltete methodologische Voraussetzung.
Nein.
Aber
Ja.
immer ist mit mir.
Ja.
Also,
Ja.
wenn Sie auf die Differenzen kurz eingehen könnten, werde ich auch
Ja.
sehr dankbar. Dankeschön.
Dankeschön. Jetzt weiß ich nicht, auf welcher Sprache. Tal vez in Espanol, ja? Okay. So, the question was first, to what extent we could use the history of the Huns. And that's, of course, the same history of the Vikings or the Mongols. To what extent did these forces really exert a major influence? All we can really say, I suppose, is that we have here examples of massive migration. And I think that was the focus. So wherever they came from, but you do, and that's the answer to the second question, don't we already have that in late antiquity? And of course we do have that. And the latest research in terms of late antiquity really indicates that there was not a massive assault of Germanic people, but rather a slow and long-term process of migration, integration, and replacement of Roman general soldiers and so forth with Germanic people. So to what extent the Huns really left an influence, that is hard to say, I don't know. But they roamed a lot. That is sort of all I could really say. We could also then quickly refer to the Avars, for example, also nomadic people. I could refer to the Magyars, another nomadic people. So these are just names that I dropped to indicate how much Europe was in movement. More I cannot really say. I do not know to what extent the Mongols or the Huns really left an influence. Even with the Vikings, and the term is a little bit problematic, let's say the Icelanders. Pillaging, sure, that does not mean really globalism, but the fact that they could travel around so much, that they had the global awareness where to go, how to go, how to find the way across all of Russia, the Volga, down to the Black Sea, cross the Mediterranean, settling in southern Italy, settling then in Normandy. These are Norsemen. That is, I think, a very important aspect. It allows me, however, to switch over to another part of the world, just in analogy. How did the Polynesians find Hawaii? These are the loneliest islands of the world, 2,000 sea miles away from any other island. And these people made it just with the stars and flow of the currents, maybe birds, whatever. And they made it and created a whole settlement of the Hawaiian cultures. That's already same time period. So we do, that is the point, I think. We understand, I think, history better if we understand it, a history in motion, in Bewegung. There's a very recent book that just came out, Dominik, that's his last name, Geschichte in Bewegung. And I like that word quite a lot. I think we understand history much better if we see it's a constantly shifting of populations, also social shifts, economic shifts, repressions here and there, violence. So I think that is gives us a better sense of the instability of history. And I think that's where then the notion of globalism helps us a little bit. That that I didn't talk really about Mesoamerica, absolutely. However, let me emphasize, since I live in Arizona, we have a lot of medieval culture. Even my own culture, the Sinaguas left my area about 1400. The name tells you everything. Sinaguas, no water. We have lots of medieval ruins in Arizona. Wupatki, Tuzigut, Mesa Verde, that's in Colorado. We have Montezuma's Castle and so forth, and Walnut Canyon. There are lots of medieval ruins in America, in Arizona. I always surprise my students by saying, hey, Middle Ages, wow, look around you. It's all medieval here. We are very ancient cultures, really. But indeed, they have nothing to do with Europe. I mean, at some point, I have to admit, as arrogant as I might be, but I have my own limits, and rightly so. There are no connections. If at all, then you can say starting the 16th century. But before, it doesn't make sense. But lots of scholars like to do this. They publish then these very popular books, very thick, very expensive, global history. And suddenly there's Mesoamerica, the Philippines, whatever. Somalia, whatever, the Ethiopian kingdom, it all suddenly fits together. That doesn't work for me. I'm looking for networks, for actual contacts. And maps are a wonderful way, as you do, narratives that describe other parts of the world. That helps me to understand a little bit intellectual mobility, mental mobility. And if that works, it makes sense. If it doesn't work, then let's leave it aside. We pay due respect to the Mesoamericans, fine, but the Mayans have nothing to do with the Europeans, sorry. Close the door. Otherwise, I open the door for everything, and that means nothing at the end. It might be also the result of American situation. You know, here in Europe, you have your European history, and that's all fine. In America, for historians, it's always a difficult and tricky situation. What should they teach? Asian history or Western European history? So I remember my son, high school, had to take world history and said, that's fine, I can help you with that. So he came home with me and said, well, what do you know about the Philippines in the 16th century? Nothing. You know, I was suddenly stunned as a, you know, and he had to cover everything and nothing. That's then the problem. If you go out and you cover everything, then it's a hodgepodge of meaningless entities. But, you know, just to come back to two examples, to trace, for example, the transmission and translation of the story of Balaam and Josaphat from language to language, that is evidence. The sale of Gerfalcons from Iceland to Mamluk Egypt, that is evidence. That I find useful. And that's the reason why, for me, in the middle, the Niederrheinische Orientbericht is great. That helps. Is that okay? Yeah, very good.
Thank you. Very quick question with very short answer. Well,
I'm sorry,
I need
yeah,
to make a very,
too
very
much.
hard choice between Professor Oliński and my student.
Ich danke Ihnen für so interessanten und inspirierenden Vortrag und möchte ich kurze Begrifflichkeit Bemerkung machen. Also Globalisation als Begriff möchte ich gerne benutzen, um bestimmte Weltgeschichte-Probleme zu klären. Aber wie weit steht diese Begrifflichkeit von alten Begriffen, wie zum Beispiel Ökumene oder Orbis Romanus und, oder Sphäre Mundus oder ganz am Ende Globus selbst. Es geht den Römer nur um die geografische Vorstellungen oder auch um die kulturell-geografische. Also wenn wir diese Ökumene als ein Kreis, als eine Art von Verbindung von Völkern betrachten, gibt es natürlich ein Prinzip, das ist die Sprache. Wenn wir Orbis Romanus sehen, dann sehen wir die bestimmten Rechte, die Vorstellungen von Recht, von Staat selbst, Angehörigkeit zu dieser Stadt und so weiter. Also ich frage mich selbst und möchte auch diese Frage vorstellen, vielleicht diesen allgemein herrschenden jetzt in der Wissenschaft, nicht nur in der Geschichte, in Sozialwissenschaften, Begriff Globalisation, bringt die bestimmte Schwierigkeiten oder vielleicht auch ein Risiko, dass wenn wir diese alten Quellen lesen, dann gehen wir ein bisschen in die weit modernisierende Vorstellungen. Wer mit wem in Verbindung bleibt, das ist okay, das ist schon eine Globalisation. Ich meine, das stimmt nicht. Es ginge damals um die bestimmten Werte wie die Sprache, Gottvorstellungen, Staatsvorstellungen und so weiter. Stimmt das? Was meinen Sie?
Also vielen Dank dafür. Thank you very much. One ironic aspect, of course, is in all historical studies, we always tend to reinvent the wheel. I mean, you know, this is, sorry, but that's reality. Every generation tries to find its own niche, and they kind of redo what we already have known lots of years ago. And frankly, if you go through a lot of historical studies from the 19th century, it's sometimes embarrassing how much they knew and how little we know today. You know, that's granted all that. But nevertheless, I think the term globalism is an interesting challenge. And we are, of course, we face questions all the time, but more, let's say, from the modern scholars than from scholars in antiquity, which is very understandable, because the medievalists are revolting against the claim by modernists that nothing happened prior to, let's say, 1980 or so. And this has simply forced us to think a little bit more broadly. Maybe we have to simply return to understandings from ancient times. But you brought up a very beautiful point, which would be really valuable. I'm not only an expert, but you mentioned the Roman Empire, and indeed there was a global empire. They certainly had trade connections with the Parthians and further Black Sea. I don't know how far, I mean, that's not my expertise, but they certainly tried everything they could to go as far east as possible, and also probably down Africa to some extent. I don't quite know how much. But that was certainly an aspect we should keep in mind. But I think it is valuable to think about the challenges. We don't have to agree with everything. I mean, I think I've expressed it clearly enough how much I'm questioning a lot of these recent studies. But I think it's also dangerous to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because it's a modern term doesn't mean that we cannot discover new things. We are becoming more sensitive, maybe, to things we have known already for a long time. And maybe, I mean, what is in history? In history, we are players. We play with the same balls, it's the same things, and we're looking simply for new configurations. So I suggest that using the term globalism allows us nicely to see things maybe in a broader context and to be more open to connections we haven't quite thought. I mean, I was shocked when I read this study about the Gerfalcons. That is such a beautiful evidence. And trade, I'm not an economic historian, but it's a very important component. By the same token, I suggest that historians consider more the literary materials that I'm better familiar with as indications of the mentality, the ideas, the concepts. So there, I think you can reach maybe not completely old, but new, a combination of new ideas. And I think that the discussion is very productive. We have a lot of attempts, a lot of different schools of thinking. So we are right in the midst of a change possible. And I find that exciting. That's, I think, that we can agree. You're an archaeologist, right? Ja, Moment mal. Wir haben uns nämlich schon vor 2008 getroffen. Und da sind Sie damals nach Athen gereist. Und Sie sagten uns damals, das habe ich immer wieder zitiert, Sie treffen in Athen nur deutsch sprechende Kollegen.
Ja, ja.
Denn die Engländer können kein Deutsch.
Master in Classical Culture.
So. Daran erinnere ich mich sehr gut, ja.
Klasse.
Sorry, it was a little anecdote.
I am terribly sorry and apologize with all those who have more curiosities, but there are some of us who need to follow or deliver classes in 5 minutes. So I am sure that if you write to Professor Classen, he will kindly answer you, and he will be also available for 5 minutes after lecture. So I invite those to use those 2 channels to address questions. Well, thank you once again to Professor Classen, to our discussants, and please join me in the final applause to our speaker.
Thank you. Dziękuję bardzo.